Good morning. This session is update from the Performance Marketing Association. My name is Gary Kibel. I'm a partner at the law firm of Davis & Gilbert in New York, and I'm also the general counsel of the PMA.
My name is Brian Littleton. I'm the president and CEO of ShareASale, and also the president of the board of directors here at the PMA. And I'll get it kickstarted a little bit. For anyone who's in the room, and I see some friendly faces and some folks that I know are well aware of this information, so sorry for that. But for any newcomers, what is the PMA? Some 5 years ago or so, a group of people, I was one of them included, but just one of many, that saw the need for a trade organization to represent our industry specifically. We wanted to create an industry for ourselves. A lot of people have said, hey, why don't you just work with the IAB? Why don't you just work with a subsection of this organization or that organization? And maybe we were a little greedy. We wanted one for ourselves. We thought that our needs were very specific. We aren't display, we aren't search. We weren't being represented by those organizations, so we wanted to make one for ourselves. At that time, that had nothing to do with affiliate nexus taxes or anything like that. But we were immediately presented with an issue, the affiliate nexus tax, that kind of proved our point. When that happened, no other organization stepped up to do pretty much anything at all. The PMA was left to do all that work, which is the right thing. Our industry came under attack, and we came together, and we're able to fight off that to some extent, which Gary's going to get to in a little bit. But it proved out the point, and from that point forward, we knew that our dealings with politicians and lawyers and lobbyists and things like that, we saw the value of the organization itself. When I went in to speak to a politician and I told them that I was a business owner from Illinois with all these employees, they were kind of like, yeah, I don't care. This issue could just be about your business. But the moment that I told them, you know what? I'm here on behalf of the PMA, and we have 200 whatever number of people behind us that feel the same way. Their eyes all lit up, and they were like, oh, well, good job. And that was important to them. So whether or not you're talking about a tax issue or a legal issue or possibly with an investor or even a client or advertiser, the value of having a trade organization behind you is there even if you don't know that you need it yet. So that's an introduction to what is the PMA. I'm going to pivot over to Gary to talk specifically about the updates from the tax issue. Gary?
Okay. So we figure we talk firstly about the affiliate nexus tax. Of course, that's not the only issue the PMA is involved in, but it's something that is on a lot of people's minds, and people would like to know where things stand. So with the affiliate nexus tax, there's now 13 states that have passed the legislation. And just to take a step back, for those of you who are not familiar with what we're talking about when we say affiliate nexus tax, back in the olden days, before the internet, sales tax was very simple. If you had a store in somebody's state, then you had to collect sales tax because you were physically present in the state. And the Supreme Court backed up that approach. Well, then with the advent of the internet, many industries were selling into states where they did not have a physical presence. And initially that was not a big dollar amount. But as the internet grew and e-commerce grew, it became a very big issue. And this is all about dollars and cents for the states. The states started to realize there were all of these out-of-state remote sellers selling products and services to our consumers in our state, and they don't have to collect sales tax. But the brick and mortar stores in the state do. So they started passing these affiliate nexus tax laws. And what they were intended to do is to say, even though you are not physically present in our state, we're going to deem you to be physically present if you engage in certain activities. So it doesn't matter that you're located in California, because of certain activities you're engaged in New York remotely via the internet, you now have to collect sales tax. And one of the key ways that you would deem that presence is through the use of affiliates. Obviously a big issue for this industry. So I did put a quick paragraph about all of the states, and I'm not really going to go through them. Arkansas is not the most important one in the United States. It's just the first one alphabetically, so that's why it's there. But I will highlight California there, which takes a somewhat similar approach, that these laws are not cut and dry. California does carve out that the mere existence of a click-through ad or a link is not going to automatically create an in-state presence for Nexus, as long as you prohibit what's called active solicitation. So if your in-state affiliate is sending out email lists and has marketing campaigns directed to people in that state, a state such as California would say, if you have affiliates in California doing those types of activities, they are your agent. And because they are there doing this on your behalf, even though you may be located in Utah, we, California, will now deem you to have a presence in our state. Connecticut, another one, you'll see dollar thresholds throughout all these states, because the approach is not that if you sell $5 worth of goods in a state, you're now suddenly subject to sales tax. All the states have a dollar threshold to allow de minimis use, one-off sales, so that you don't have to deal with sales tax. However, these dollar amounts differ from state to state. $10,000 is usually a pretty common number, meaning that if you have sales in the state of greater than $10,000 through the use of affiliates, you may have to collect the sales tax. Connecticut is a somewhat low one with $2,000, and then right below it, Georgia has $50,000. Kansas and Maine have a very, very standard approach. They have the $10,000 threshold, very standard. Minnesota also has the $10,000 threshold. Missouri, there are a couple that have interesting carve-outs or what we'll call workarounds, whereas the state has said in addition to the dollar threshold, we'll give other reasons why a remote seller does not need to collect the sales tax. So Missouri provided a carve-out for advertising, general advertising in media, which is a good thing because that's not only links and click-throughs, but could be banner ads that are also carved out. So New York, my home state, which has been very, very active in this, actually got very detailed in terms of their workaround. They took the similar approach of California in stating that if your in-state affiliates are not engaged in active solicitation, then we won't deem you to have a presence. But they went further. They said you need to do two things. Number one, in your contracts with those affiliates, you need to expressly prohibit them from engaging in the active solicitation. And number two, you need to get an affidavit from them annually certifying that they have not engaged in the active solicitation. So it's a decent workaround. This came from the Department of Revenue and Taxation in New York to give out-of-state sellers a way to avoid the tax. But there's a real process required. And I think in the advent of the Supreme Court issue, which I'll talk about in a moment, I think the New York State Tax Department is going to start to audit about this. And they will send out letters asking for copies of contracts, copies of affidavits. So it's important to have this. What many marketers have done with these states is simply pull out their affiliates because they don't want to deal with the workarounds. They don't want to deal with the paperwork, and they don't want to deal with the possibility of tripping up. But there are ways to work around. North Carolina and Pennsylvania, again, somewhat standard approaches. Last individual state I'll highlight, Vermont. As a friend last night referred to their law as the peer pressure law. It's really very interesting that they passed an affiliate nexus law, but says it does not become effective until at least 15 other states have passed the law. So Vermont says, we're going to pass a law and require a tax, but we don't want to be the only guys out there and look bad. So let's let 15 other states look bad first, and we'll be number 16. So as I said, there's 13 states that have passed already, including Vermont, so I think the peer pressure is building on our friends up there. I have a list here of 9 pending states that are looking at bills. There could be more. I mean, these are, some of these are in different stages of whether or not they've been discussed in committee or drafted or voted upon. But as we'll discuss in a moment, I think this list is going to grow very quickly. So the PMA's big victory in Illinois. Not going to go into too much detail on this unless folks want to talk about it, but Illinois had passed the affiliate nexus tax, and the PMA decided to sue on this issue and challenge the Illinois Department of Revenue. And the PMA prevailed in the circuit court. And then Illinois appealed. They appealed the decision that the law in Illinois was unconstitutional. And last October, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld the lower court decision, saying that this law is not constitutional in Illinois. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to Illinois, being that you are there, and it's certainly an important thing near and dear to your heart.
I won't add too much other than it was a very exciting morning, I can tell you, in Illinois. We had, I'd say it was about 10:30 or so by the time the entire Illinois affiliate marketing delegation, so to speak, had met at the bar for several shots. It was a ton of work. It was a lot of resources, a lot of effort put in from the PMA and other folks that were volunteering and helping us out. And again, like I said earlier, it proved a point in a big way, a proof of concept, and certainly very personally gratifying. That's all I'll add, I guess.
So while Brian and his friends were drinking in Illinois, things were not as rosy over in New York. Overstock and Amazon sued New York over the New York affiliate nexus tax law, and they lost. And they appealed it to the highest court in New York State, which is called the Court of Appeals, and they lost in the highest court in New York State. So Amazon and Overstock decided that's not enough. We're going to go to the Supreme Court of the United States and take up this issue, because there is a legitimate federal issue. Two things. Number one, we have a split between two states. We have a state in New York which says this type of affiliate nexus tax is permissible, and we have a state in Illinois which says it's not. So there's a split there, and that's something the Supreme Court is usually interested in resolving, because it's difficult to have inconsistent laws in the United States, and also because the basis of this issue was challenging a Supreme Court ruling from a number of years ago which defined what would be necessary to create nexus with a seller. So we all thought this was a perfect case for the Supreme Court, that they would take this. And briefs were put together, and the PMA put together an amicus brief to support it, and was submitted to the Supreme Court. And just last month, the Supreme Court said, no thanks. That's not unusual, because the Supreme Court gets thousands of requests for reviews, and they select, these days, probably less than 100. It's really an incredibly small percentage of cases that are actually reviewed by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court just turned it aside without any comment. So what does this mean? This means that in New York, the affiliate tax can be enforced. And this means that in Illinois, in the current iteration of the law, it cannot be enforced. So we have a different approach in different states. So what can we do to resolve this? Well, Congress had been considering the Marketplace Fairness Act. And this would be a federal law that would establish how do we deal with sales tax by remote sellers. And it would be good to have one standard, so that we don't have to have different standards in 13 states right now, and who knows how many states going forward. I mentioned that the list of pending laws may grow. Because the Supreme Court has turned it down and basically said New York's law is upheld, you can expect other states now to look into this law, because they realize that the Supreme Court's not going to automatically turn it down, and there may be some money there, and all the states are looking for revenue. So I think you will see more states passing the law. In the meantime, we're waiting to see if Congress would put in place a national standard. So the Marketplace Fairness Act, what it says is it authorizes states to tax remote resellers. They don't have to tax them, but they would have the right to tax them. It would help with coordination, because there would be one taxing entity in the state that would take care of all the sales tax for any jurisdiction within the state. And you see at the end there, the dollar exception is a bit higher than the 10,000. The remote resellers with less than 1 million in remote sales are exempt from collecting the sales tax. So that's a good outcome in terms of helping affiliates. The bill makes a lot of sense. It makes sense on both sides of the aisle, because while it is technically a tax law, it actually helps brick and mortar stores in their states. And so it passed very overwhelmingly in the Senate, 69 votes. Prospects in the House are a little dicey, because as soon as you mention the word tax in the House, there's a good third of the House of Representatives that will say, I don't care if this tax cures cancer, I am not voting for this. So it's a big issue, and we'll see what happens there. With that, I'll pause for a second unless there are any questions on tax issues before Brian jumps into some other PMA points. Yes?
I have two questions. One, the Supreme Court turned down hearing. Can you apply to have the Supreme Court hearing again? Can you reapply?
Sure. The question was, and we do have a microphone for questions, but I'll just repeat it up here. You know, the Supreme Court turned it down, but can you reapply? Not for this case, but there could be others. Although the others are probably now disincentivized to appeal, because if the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it this time, there better be some very interesting new facts or new legal issue to analyze to review it. Now, one of the issues could be that there's a split not just between 2 states, but between 20 states. So it could be a greater federal issue for the court to look at. But if another retailer came and brought it right now, I think it would be turned aside pretty quickly.
Then my other question had to do with the dollar amount, the $10,000 threshold that seems to be pretty prevalent. Is that per affiliate or is that per merchant and across all their affiliates, that $10,000?
The question was about the $10,000 limit in most states. It's generally for the merchant. I mean, because this law is it's interesting. It's all about the merchants, but it's the affiliates who get dinged. The tax requirement is on the merchant. It's the merchant's obligation to collect the tax if the affiliates are doing certain activities. The affiliate does not have to collect the tax, although the merchant may push certain obligations onto the affiliate. This is all about the merchant collecting and remitting that tax. Okay? All right, Brian, why don't you
Sure thing.
hop into some other interesting PMA activities?
So that's obviously a lot of what has happened with regards to the PMA over the last few years. The issues have come up fast and furious, and has, as I mentioned, taken up a lot of our time and resources because it's a very important issue that affects affiliate marketers directly. However, as I stated in my opening remarks, it wasn't the reason we founded the PMA. In fact, it was just an issue that came up after that. So this year, in 2014, the board of directors actually just had our first meeting of the year, the new board that was elected in November. We had our first meeting here at Affiliate Summit a couple days ago. And I wanted to go over some of our agenda this year for what we're going to do. As we pivot a little bit away from the nexus tax issue and try and get back to some of the core principles that we talked about 5 years ago or so, we have a lot of reorganization and kind of regrouping to do. As I said, the tax issues are difficult. They require people, they require time, they require money. And as we fought them off as best we could, we realized now at this point we kind of have to regroup and look back and reorganize. So there's going to be a lot of that, a lot of small initiatives that you're going to see more from a governance standpoint, trying to structure ourselves a little bit differently. But also we're going to focus a lot on content that's going out there, content specifically coming out from the PMA. One of my main goals is for any of you, whether or not you are an advertiser, whether you're a network, even if you're a competing network to me, I want you to have resources that come out of the PMA that help you sell your business to whoever it is you're trying to sell it to. And I mean from a sales perspective, clients, as I mentioned, investors, things like that. That content could be wide-ranging. It could be proof of, for example, the size of the industry. If you have an advertiser that's coming to you and saying like, well, I'm not sure if I want to get into performance space, you know, exactly what does it mean for me if I do get into the performance space? I want you to be able to lean on an entire industry resource to help you as opposed to trying to do all that research yourself. For one, it's a lot harder to do by yourself, but for two, it's a lot more believable when it comes from an entire industry. If you point to a number that you've made up, for example, to your sales prospect, they might say, well, you know, I'm not sure I believe them. I think that might be a little bit different, or they're trying to sell me. If you point to something that's just coming out of the PMA, which every piece of content that comes out of the PMA is reviewed from the entire board of directors, that means, hey, you know, there's at least somebody here and a few people that agree with me or agree with that point. So that's my main goal. You're going to see white papers, you're going to see best practices, you're going to see things on very specific issues, possibly staying in the regulatory field with things like FTC guidelines. That stuff comes up with bloggers obviously a lot right now. You're going to see things, as I mentioned, on size of industry. We have goals with regards to hiring practices and jobs. The PMA has a job board, for example, which is something that you can obviously just go on and use, but we want to look into more the scope of what's it like to hire an affiliate manager, for example. What are some kind of appropriate salary ranges for that in different levels? Again, just to give you help in your business that you can't get necessarily all by yourself. If we can all kind of team together and get these resources out, it'll help everybody. So that's part one of content that goes out from the PMA. Part two is stuff that I rely on you for, and that's the councils. So the councils are a huge piece of the way that we both bring in members and put out content to the industry. And it's definitely where membership comes in on our entire initiative, is what I've mentioned, because it's member-led. A member comes to us typically looking for and telling the board, hey, this is a big issue. I think this is something that the PMA should get behind. And say, okay, well, is it something that you can lead? Can you lead a council? Can you put out content? Can you bring a group of people together, 15 or so people, to sit on this council, come up with some ideas, hash it out, and get that out? Those things have been, for example, we have a compliance council, which is chaired by Dave from Brand Verity, Dave Natziger. They have come together, and I believe there's about 12 or 15 folks that are on that council. They have come together and put out some really good white papers on the basics of compliance in an industry such as performance marketing. It's not a commercial for Brand Verity. That's not what we want, obviously. It's not a commercial for anybody. It's basic information so that any advertiser coming into this that has heard, hey, I hear there's some things with compliance and affiliate marketing, they can look at this piece of information and say, okay, these are the main issues. These are things that I need to be aware of. And it's some really good information that I highly recommend checking out. Again, that's 100% member-driven. So if you're sitting out there, if you see an opportunity for yourself as a leader in this industry to fill a gap and say, hey, you know what, the PMA is never putting out anything on this. Well, then I would say come talk to me, because you might be the exact leader we're looking for to try and chair that council, to try and get the information out to help, again, the entire industry itself. So those are two pieces. You're going to see content from us, meaning the board of directors, and you're going to see content from yourselves, meaning the councils and the members. The frequency and size of those are all going to be dependent upon how many folks really kind of step up and do that work through the councils, and obviously to the extent that we can volunteer our time on the board. So with that, I would like to open up to questions, and I know as I was told on the way in by a good friend of mine, he said he wasn't going to heckle, but to be honest, that's exactly what we want. We are an entirely volunteer board that in almost in every case has a very, very time-consuming job that they have. They run their own businesses, and at the same time volunteer their time to try and do something that is positive for the entire industry, which means we really require industry participation in the form of, hey, I think you guys need to be doing this, or pointing out where we haven't gone right. Because again, it's volunteer, so a lot of times it's maybe the second or third thing that's on my mind or any of our board's minds as we're trying to get it done. So questions, heckle, whatever you want to do, go for it. There's a microphone, or you can just shout it out if you have a sign.
Hi, Brian. I'm not going to heckle. So I was a PMA member very early on, and I was on one of the committees for, I think it was like standardization of coupons, because I was, and still am involved in the coupon industry. And I can recall 3-hour-long conference calls where we literally spent 45 minutes on a 4-sentence paragraph. And in the end, I'm like, guys, this is great if we have these standardizations, but what kind of enforcement do we have on these things? Even like the click to reveal, and we can say that, that it's a standardization that, that across the networks, maybe we have a setting that shows that click to reveal is allowed, but there's really no enforcement to what the PMA comes out with. So I guess my question is, where are you heading to that, and are the various committees moving forward, or it's just still talking about things?
First of all, thank you. I totally understand where you're coming from. As I sat on some of those, they were different than councils at that point. They were committees, actually, I believe, right? And that was several years ago. There's no question it's a first of all a giant challenge to get people into a room and agree on any set of things, much less something so controversial as coupons. It's not the expectation from the board right now that there is that the PMA wishes to become a police force for any kind of behavioral issue, whether it's with regards to adware or coupons or whatnot. But I'll tell you where it is important, even if it's a standard that's not enforced, and that's for people that are outside the industry looking in. They see issues recognized. They say, hey, you know what, the trade organization for this entire group has said that this is the way that you should not do it. And if you choose to, say, go totally against that and still do it, now there's something to point at and say, you know what, this person's must be doing something wrong because they're kind of outside the scope of what a trade group has said is okay. That doesn't mean that it's police. The PMA doesn't come over and say, hey, Mr. Coupon Site, you cannot do this, because not only on our board but in our entire industry, you're operating your business the way you think is best. I'm operating mine the way I think best. But if a standard can be agreed on, if there is a consensus amongst the entire group that this specific activity is something that we do not think is good for the industry, that's the kind of thing that over time people looking from the outside are going to recognize, and I think affects behavior in the long term. I will totally give you the frustrations over trying to come up with language. I think the committees were in that it was, again, that was very early on, not a lot of structure from the PMA in general. We were trying to find our way and fight off legal issues at the same time, so I won't totally give you that. I think we've grown a lot in our ability to handle those kinds of discussions and we found out which ones we can have and which ones are maybe non-starters because of all the different angles. But I guess that's my answer to policing.
Yeah, and I would add to that, the guidelines and standards and whatnot are really valuable when you're especially trying to get business from other folks who may not be familiar with your industry. We see all the time with direct marketing, folks saying I comply with the DMA's guidelines, or with interactive advertising I comply with IAB guidelines, and it's really valuable when you're out trying to get business to say there's a standard that I comply with. And with the performance industry where there's an issue that you need to prove that it's legitimate and dispel any concerns about fraud and whatnot, to say that there is a standard that exists and we comply with it and it can be tested against and audited against. That's really a great value for companies.
Big value. I mean, if you go to sell your business and you're looking at you're proving out value, proving out your revenue number, and you can say, hey, you know what, I did all this and I did it within the bounds of what my industry says is okay to do. That's big value. We want to be putting out a lot more things to try and help people stay within those. Any other questions? Greg? I've never sat in a room where you've not asked me a question. All right.
You want me to hop in some of the other?
Sure, if there are no other questions, and by the way, I know that there are, and a lot of people don't like to speak up. That's totally fine, I get that. I will be here after this session. I actually only have to get over to that, I think it's the Pinnacle Awards. Is it 11 or whatnot? Can anybody verify that for me? I think it is. I need to get to that, but I'll stay here as long as I can, and I'll be at my booth all day. If you have questions about the PMA that you don't want to say out loud, feel free to come and talk to me. This is something that's really, I'm really personally passionate about. I've been involved in it for a very long time. As I told, and the board, is in 100% agreement with me on this one, we're the caretakers of this for you right now. And so we're all very passionate about it. There's several sitting in this room right now. Come talk to me. I'd be more than willing to answer questions privately.
All right, so I'm going to transition to about 10 minutes or so to give you some free legal advice. Woohoo! You don't have to pay anybody for this. As what we're talking about in industry, in terms of best practices, it's certainly important to observe all best practices and be aware of what the issues are out there so that you don't become a target for a regulator or for a lawsuit from someone you're dealing with, or to otherwise damage your brand or your business. So I thought I would take a few minutes and just go through a couple of sort of hot topics in the interactive media industry so that you can get some real takeaways and go back and look at your businesses and analyze and sort of do a self-analysis to see if you are complying with best practices. All right, so first thing, always trying to dispel the rumor. All content on the internet is free, that it's just there. You can take it. You see a nice picture, take it, put it on your website. You see some good music, just download it and use it in your brand. That is certainly not the case. And the advent of social media has made this a lot more challenging. Even some of the largest brands out there have problems with this issue because their account people see content posted on Facebook, posted on Twitter, and believe they can just grab it. This case, I think, is a very good example. There was a French newspaper that saw a photograph on Twitter that someone had posted, obviously very publicly, and it was a photograph of some people during the relief efforts in Haiti after the natural disaster there. And so the French newspaper just took the photo that they saw on Twitter, that the whole world could see on Twitter, and published it. And the photographer sued and said, I never gave you, this French newspaper, the right to use my photograph. Yes, I uploaded this photograph to Twitter for the entire world to see without any license or controls, but that doesn't mean I've given everyone the right to use it. And the French newspaper defended the lawsuit by saying, Twitter's terms of service say when you upload content, you give the broadest license possible to use this content. And the court said, that's the license between the photographer and Twitter. That does not mean that extends to everyone else in the world. So, very important takeaway. If you see content on the internet that you like, do not copy it and take it over to your site, even if it's on something as incredibly public as Twitter. A better way is to link the content if you want to discuss it or show it to people, but you cannot grab it on your own. You may have heard many times, and actually Brian mentioned as well about FTC endorsements, and we've been harping on this for a few years about them going after bloggers and social media sites, and it's not slowing up. To explain very briefly, the Federal Trade Commission has what are called guidelines on endorsements and testimonials. These have existed for decades. The idea is that consumers should understand when they hear a message whether or not that message is being paid for by a marketer. Now, I said these guidelines have been out for decades, and they were fairly simple to deal with. If you see a Buick car commercial on television and Peyton Manning is driving around in the car talking about how much he loves his car, you know he's been paid for that. You know that he didn't do that out of the goodness of his heart and his love of Buicks. You realize he is a paid sponsor. There's nothing to disclose. But if a blogger is on a site, maybe a gaming site, reviewing a new game that came out, how do you know that that blogger has not been paid for their comments? Or how do you know they didn't get free products in order to talk about the products? So the FTC has said, in the interactive world, the digital world, these types of relationships need to be disclosed. The blogger needs to disclose, I'm being paid by this company to review their product, or I'm getting some free products from them. And they need to make this disclosure online. So what do they need to do? A blogger word-of-mouth marketer has to disclose these material connections, that they got money or a free product or some benefit. Maybe they got a trip someplace if they reviewed a product or service. The blogger would have to disclose that. Celebrities always have a duty to disclose that they are paid endorsers. I had the honor of meeting Mr. Hogan in the conference room in the exhibit hall. He doesn't need to disclose anything. It's pretty obvious that his involvement. But if the involvement with the company is not obvious, it's not clear to the reasonable consumer, there needs to be disclosure. And the one tricky part is employees. Employees who are online promoting your product or service, they should be disclosing that they are your employees. I was once at a large agency, and one of the creative folks was coming out with a book. And one of the creative directors said to all the employees, hey, when the book comes out, everybody go on Amazon and say how awesome it is. And I said, whoa, 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 you got to be careful there. That's a perfect situation where they need to disclose that they're employees. You can say what you want online as long as you make the proper disclosure. Let me give you a quick example. Curtis Jackson, better known as 50 Cent, had tweeted back in January 2011, and he was tweeting about the stock market and tweeting about stocks. And he said, HNHI is the stock symbol for TVG. They're launching 15 different products. They are no joke. Get it now. But the one thing that Mr. Cent did not disclose is that he owned 7.5 million shares in the company and had warrants for 22.5 million more. Shockingly, 50 Cent has sway over the financial markets in the United States, and the stock actually went up. And right away, he gets calls from his lawyers and his publicists and everyone saying, hey, Fiddy, we got an issue here. You got to fix this. So he goes back on Twitter with a follow-up tweet, which I absolutely love since I seriously doubt that he wrote it. And he said, my own HNHI stock thoughts on it are my opinion. Talk to a financial advisor. The HNHI is the right investment for me, or may not be the right investment for you. Surprisingly, the SEC did look into this, but found no liability. The stock actually went back down after he disclosed. But the point is, we're not saying you cannot talk online. You can talk online all you want. It's just making the proper disclosure. When 50 Cent made this first tweet on Twitter, all he needed to do is at the end say, I own stock. If he said something as simple as I own stock, that would solve it. And then anybody who's reading it can take his comments with a grain of salt. Another example, Nutrisystem on Pinterest. As we deal with more platforms, Pinterest, Instagram, and others as advertising vehicles, it becomes a little more complex about what disclosures are required. So Nutrisystem had this board where women could post true stories. Women could post real customers, real successes. So the women there were posting, you probably can't see it, the first woman said she lost 96 pounds, second woman said she lost 73 pounds, and on and on. And these are women who independently posted these pictures and said that they actually lost this weight. Nutrisystem did not create these ads. Well, there was a claim against Nutrisystem in a group that's called the National Advertising Division. There's a sort of a self-regulatory process in the United States if advertisers want to challenge one another's advertisements. They don't have to go to court. They can go through a self-regulatory process. AT&T, Verizon go after each other all the time about coverage maps using that process. And so a claim was brought about this, saying that this is deceptive because those results are not typical. All those pictures up there highlighting losing 96 pounds, 73 pounds, those are not typical results. Now Nutrisystem says, we just made a Pinterest board. All we asked was women to post their photos and tell their stories. We didn't do anything. And this self-regulatory group said, Nutrisystem, you have an obligation to post that results are not typical, to make disclosures to the consumer that this may not be the type of result that they would experience. So again, even though you're maybe running a Pinterest board and encouraging consumers to post photographs, you may have an obligation to make some sort of a disclosure. One of the big questions we often get is, how do you make a disclosure online? Especially in Twitter, 140 characters. And industry trade groups and the Federal Trade Commission encourage these types of hashtags. Paid ad. The Word of Mouth Marketing Association also says SPON for sponsored, just to identify to a consumer what's going on there. One other very important thing as you get involved in these areas is to control access to your accounts. Your accounts are very valuable and they speak to a wide audience, and you don't want to have a mistake. Chrysler has a new advertising campaign which they've been going on for a few years called Imported from Detroit, if you've seen that tagline. The idea is that they're not running away from the idea of Detroit as a depressed city. They're embracing the idea that they're from Detroit. So they hired a social media agency in Detroit to promote this concept for them. And one of the employees at the social media agency had a bad commute to work that day in Detroit. And what do people do these days whenever anything bad happens in their lives? They have to go on social media and tell everyone they know about it. So the employee got to work and he posted this tweet. He said, I find it ironic that Detroit is known as the Motor City, yet no one here knows how to freaking drive. Does anybody know what's really bad with that tweet? besides the profanity? Yeah, where he tweeted from. He didn't tweet this from Bob, the employee's Twitter account. He tweeted this from the official Chrysler Auto's Twitter account, followed by over 1 million people. That was very bad. The agency very quickly called up Chrysler and said, we're very sorry, it was an oversight, the employee's been fired. And Chrysler said, thank you, and you're fired as well. So definitely want to control, but it's a very insightful thing. Who has control to your Twitter accounts, your Facebook page? Who has control to your web hosting? Controlling access to these IDs and passwords. This is one example. I could have put 20 up here. There are so many of these where there's been a bad tweet that has been put up and needed to be taken down. So very important. What you put online can really, really hurt you. I can't say that enough. Be careful what you put online, especially when it comes to personal information. Don't post sensitive personal information online, right? Don't post sensitive personal information online. Few other hot topics that are going on. If you do any sort of behavioral advertising, I'm sure you've seen the little icon in the upper right-hand corner there. This is the ad choices icon that has been served trillions upon trillions of times on the internet. If you engage in online behavioral advertising, retargeting, working with any vendors that will do this for you, there is a self-regulatory program about making disclosures to consumers that these ads are behaviorally targeted ads. It is not a law. The FTC is very much in favor of this, but it is not a law. It is just guidance. But there is an industry trade association called the DAA, which is a collection of a number of trade associations that manages this program. The advice for you is that if you are buying targeted, retargeted ads online, make sure that your vendor is complying with the DAA principles. Because what's happening is, there's another group, the Better Business Bureau, is going out and trying to name and shame marketers who are engaged in online behavioral targeting without making these types of disclosures. So make sure the vendors that you work with make these types of disclosures. Very quickly, the FTC had a document called the .com disclosures, which they published back in, I think, about 2000. And these were disclosures about how to advertise on the internet, how to make proper disclosures on the internet. Well, it had been over a decade since they updated these disclosures. They recently updated them this past year, talking about how you make disclosures, where are they, proximity to banner ads, if there's not enough real estate in the banner ad, how do you deal with these issues? It's an important issue. Think if you're selling, a weight loss product, a very, very sensitive area, and there needs to be disclosures. You need to make sure those are in appropriate places. Back in New York, our New York Attorney General just a few months ago brought actions against 19 different individuals for posting fake Yelp reviews. That's a big issue, and everyone knows who uses Yelp or any review site that having phony reviews is an issue. And it may be the employees or the owners of the site going in there and posting these fake reviews. I like what the New York Attorney General said. He said, astroturfing is the 21st century's version of false advertising, and prosecutors have many tools at their disposal to put an end to it. So they are looking at what is being posted online. Again, if an employee is going to say something great about a product or service, they can do it, as long as they say, I work there, so that consumers know. I want to show you a quick video here. Analytics are very, very important to any business, and you need to pay attention to what works in terms of advertising. Let me just see if I can play this video for you very quickly.
Peter, come take a look at this.
Mr. Daniels.
Mr. Daniels.
Look at this.
What's this? The numbers, they keep getting bigger and bigger.
The clicks are off the charts.
Yeah.
Yoshi, it's Walter. We're back.
Yes, sir. More shifting.
I need more trees. More trees? I'll get you more trees.
Hey, take a look at wood pulp.
Everything you got on wood pulp right now.
He really loves that thing.
Just I think a very interesting video that obviously analytics are critical to this industry, and making sure you have the right analytics is very, very important so you don't start publishing encyclopedias again. But what is working these days and what's becoming a very hot issue, the last thing I'll probably talk about is native advertising, which you may have heard. It's very hot in the press. Native advertising is the new big thing because it works. So, what is native advertising? The one quote here is, native advertising means advertising in the native central format of the publisher or property. Basically, it's advertising that looks pretty close to the editorial. So you have a hard time telling where the editorial starts and stops and where the advertising starts and stops. And there's a blurring of the lines. The reason it's very popular is, as it says in the middle there, native ads register 18% higher for purchase intent and 9% higher for brand affinity than banner ads. So again, what metrics are working, that's where people are going to go. And native advertising is becoming a very hot area, and what typically happens is that regulators start looking into this area.
I'm sorry, can you explain again what native ads are?
Sure. I think it may be good if I pop forward 2 slides and I'll give you a good example. So the question is, what are native ads? Sponsored stories, promoted tweets. You've seen outbrain at the bottom of certain content. That's what's called native ad, because there are 2 different rules in this world. There are rules that apply to content, what I called editorial, an article, a news story. And then there's rules that apply to commercial advertisements. There's First Amendment protected speech, and then there's commercial speech. And there's a very, very different legal approach to both. You can say things in an article, in an opinion piece, that may not be supported, that can go much, much further. You can talk about maybe a celebrity if it's relevant to the area. There are a lot of things you can do in articles and in First Amendment protected speech, but you cannot do that in commercial speech. So what advertisers have long done is try to blur the lines so that they can bring the 2 together and have more latitude in what they do in their advertising, and also so the consumer's not clear. When a consumer buys a magazine, if anyone does buy magazines anymore, when they buy the magazine, they're not going to the newsstand saying, I want to buy a magazine because they have great ads. They're going because they said the magazine's got good articles. They want to read the articles. So advertisers are trying to infiltrate into those areas. And that's what's happening online. So, a very simple thing, Twitter, having the sponsored tweets. That is native advertising. Facebook, having sponsored stories. That is native advertising. CNN, having outbrain articles at the bottom. That is native advertising. So I'm saying this is a very hot issue, and the FTC held a workshop on this in DC a few months ago. Very, very big issue. You might think this is what the internet has brought us to, that this is a new, big, important topic. Not really. The first comment from the FTC on native advertising came out in 1968 because a newspaper article had reviews of restaurants, and they used the same format and general appearance for ads about the restaurants in the articles. So not a new issue, but definitely one of the hot issues. And it's important because when you mix in affiliate links, and of course I highlight affiliate, understanding where the editorial stops and where the commercial starts. And it's all about what is clear to the consumers. I mentioned there was a workshop in December, and the FTC is probably looking for targets to bring claims against people. They look whenever anything is deceptive online, creepy online, and getting consumers concerned. That's what they're looking for. My very last slide I'll share with you. It's just my general guidance. Just don't be creepy online. Do not freak out consumers, because then you might have someone come after you. This is a coupon that I got back in New York. I went, it was an offline example, but I went to a local burger place near where I live. It's one of these new trendy burger places, and I figured I'd order some burgers and take them home. And so I ordered the burgers. I'd never been there before, and it was a nice place. Ordered the burgers, and then about 2 months later, during the month of my birth, I get this coupon in the mail at home. It says, "Happy birthday, Gary. And here's a free burger that you can get." And I think to myself, how in the world do these people know when my birthday is? I bought burgers there once, but how did I buy my burgers? My credit card. And I swipe my credit card. And there are companies that can do data matching for you and match up data so that hopefully maybe they didn't get my full birth date, the day and the year, but they at least got the month. And there was no disclosure to me that this would happen. And as as someone who deals in advertising and privacy law, this really freaked me out that I got this coupon. I mean, I went back and got my free burger, of course, I'm not stupid. But the whole point is just tell consumers what you're doing. There's always a battle between marketing folks and legal and compliance folks. And the simple resolution is tell consumers what you're doing, and that solves so many problems.
All right. Well, thank you, Gary. That was great stuff. Unless there are any last questions, I believe we're coming to the end of this session. Anybody have any questions on that? Sure. 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 You can come up here if you want.
I just want to make a comment, and in the spirit of Gary and his full disclosure, I will disclose to all of you that I am currently a board member of the PMA. But I wanted to just share, Eric had a very good question earlier on when it came to enforcement, and two things struck me, and I just wanted to say it to this group. Number one, Gary talked about the DAA and how they have put some guidelines in place that people are now following, and people are saying, if you want to be a good steward, you should follow these guidelines. And if and when the PMA can get to a point where we're actually issuing those things, perhaps we can be that body for this organization. And people will know that these guidelines are things that should be followed. But we need to get to that point. The most important comment I want to make before everyone goes is, I've been on for 3 years now. This is not your father's PMA. There have been such tremendous changes structurally to the way the organization is built and run that if you haven't looked at it for a while, just take another look. For one thing, the board has been divided into operating committees. People are actually rolling up their sleeves and doing a tremendous amount of work in small groups that can bring it back to the board for review. The compliance, the councils that have been put in place. We've selected appropriate chair people for these. People can volunteer to be on these councils. It's not as if they're handpicked by Brian or myself. So people say, hey, I'd love to be a part of this, and they can get a voice heard as a member of the PMA. So if you haven't, take another look. And if you have, tell people that you know, because the critical mass is important. The more people we can get involved, the more of a difference we can make in this industry.
Thank you, Tony. That was my favorite question ever. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking your time to listen to us. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks very much, everyone.